Hi, and welcome to the Thank God for the Beatles podcast. Today's episode features an in-depth look at the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band recording sessions, the songs, alternate takes, historical notes, fun facts, you name it. Sgt. Pepper is one of the most influential and iconic albums ever recorded. This album featured the freedom that the Beatles craved, and it also highlighted their incredible creativity so that they were able to paint a musical canvas that was unlike any other album at that time. I'm your host, Karen, and joining me as co-host is my older brother, Jeff. Hey, Jeff.
Good morning.
If you listened to our first episode, you know that we are Beatle nuts and love talking about these four guys. Jeff and I have been having these brother and sister talks over the years, as I'm sure many of you do with your friends and family. So let's get right into the discussion. But first, here's a honest disclosure, which is I am one of those Beatle nerds, or those Beatle numbnuts, who ordered a Paul McCartney Sgt. Pepper costume from eBay. So I have the costume. I have all of the appropriate patches. I even ordered the black pom-poms so that my mother could sew them at the bottom of the jacket and on the back of the jacket as well. She also sewed on all the patches, and I found myself a beaded talisman, just like Paul had. He has it hanging from his right side of his jacket. So I've worn it to a few times, Halloween parties, but I'm kind of over it now. I don't really see a need to wear my Sgt. Pepper costume, but it was something that always stuck with me from being a young child and seeing this album that, oh my God, I wanted one of those costumes. It was incredible, the colors. Frankly, I like Ringo's pink costume, but I always identify
and John's
with
green
Paul.
one, yeah, apparently.
So that was, you see all these folks at the Paul McCartney concerts wearing their Sgt. Pepper costumes, or the little children with their costumes. They get to go on stage. I mean, imagine if you're Paul and all you see are all these costumes coming on.
Well, as a footnote to that, I also borrowed that very same Paul McCartney Sgt. Pepper outfit for a Halloween about 3 years ago. So while she's now just gotten over it, I've just gotten into it. In fact, I've actually pondered, buying another one, a John Lennon version. I think I like his, for some future Halloween occasion. Of course, I would not wear it on any other occasion. It's just the collector in me would love to have it.
Well, you have to make it period correct. I mean, you have to have the correct patches, medals, and it's a side note. I think that John went to Pete Best's mother, Mona, to get the medals for that costume to wear, that her husband or her someone's, maybe it was her father's medals to use. Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. So winding back here, setting the stage for this album. This album was recorded from November of 66 to, it was released on June 1st, 1967. And the Beatles were at the end of touring. Their last concert was in August of 66. Mm-hmm. They'd had some interesting times where John made his Jesus remark, which really upset many Americans. They were burning the Beatle records. So the Beatles had come to a point where they had it with touring. They had it with doing the same songs.
I think it was also a matter of them being fed up with not being able to hear themselves. They did not have the fold-back speakers where they could hear what they were playing, so they felt that their musicianship was in decline. It was no longer enjoyable performing songs from 2 albums ago. They couldn't play anything new, and it was nothing but screaming. And I think they had enough of that, in addition to the political pressure that resulted from just voicing their opinions.
So one of the things that really influenced the Beatles was the release of Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. And I believe that happened, I think, in May of 66. Mm-hmm. And songs like Wouldn't It Be Nice, God Only Knows, John B. Sloop
John B.
When you listen to that album and you listen to how clear everything sounds and you hear all the variety of percussion, what Paul McCartney has said is that it truly, the articulation of that album was what was so enthralling to them, that it was unlike anything else. And also, the bass lines on that album were phenomenal too.
Double bass lines, in fact. Glockenspiels, drums.
The Christmas bells.
And remember, Brian is deaf in one ear, so everything was mixed to mono. But he still heard this beautiful aural landscape, and he was able to create that. Of course, the other Beach Boys, when they came in to perform their vocals, had no idea what they were getting into and questioned it. Of course, they don't question the wisdom of it now. It's one of the greatest records of all time, and you know that Paul McCartney, being the musical aficionado that he was, as well as a competitor, wanted to make something even grander. So his ambitions were stimulated by Pet Sounds. He loved Pet Sounds. He loved God Only Knows. He loved all the songs on it. And he determined that the Beatles would make their own, not Pet Sounds, but their own album that would achieve a kind of technical breakthrough or proficiency. So the ambition seemed like it was very risky for him to go into this new project. The Beatles were ready to let their hair down and go for broke, basically. They had a huge budget to work with, and that's how it started.
Well, think of the Beatles' ages. At this time, I think the youngest was George, about 23. Ringo,
25, I think.
Well, 67. He's younger than...
about 24, 25. Yeah. He was youngest.
They were young. And what they were so excited about when we talk about this freedom and this opportunity for them to paint this extravagant and substantive canvas was that they wanted to do songs that could not necessarily be replicated on stage, that they had released that and let it go, and now they could just focus on the music and bringing everything into it. And it was like, I would say it was like kids in a candy shop, where with George Martin's expert guidance of understanding and, his work with, I guess it was Dudley Moore, and getting all these sounds and being the collector and all the effects.
Mm-hmm. In fact, the effects that you're referring to were in a staircase in EMI Studios. They just happened to have the luxury and the good fortune to be near all these effects, which include audience effects, animal effects, that were literally taken and recorded live in some situations and saved and stored. So the Beatles wanted to throw everything at this album and use that. They were looking for different sounds, different ways to mic things, different instruments that they've never heard of before. So that's part of what stimulated. They wanted to try everything and make it work. And it also challenged George Martin technologically and the engineers how to achieve a sound that they wanted. So George Martin, in effect, was literally the fifth Beatle in this album, and we'll get into that.
No question that George really worked with them so closely in actualizing their dream and what they're hearing in their head. Mm-hmm. And that's the magic of this album. And so as we know the history of this, of the origins, is that Paul and Mal Evans, who was their roadie or right-hand man, were coming back from Kenya. And on the plane, Paul says that something about Paul says they were talking about names for an idea. And it was handing him the salt and pepper packet. Mm-hmm. And Mal had said, "What's that?" Because it said S and P on the packet. And Mal said, or Paul said, "It's salt and pepper." Now, we really don't know. I mean, it could have been Mal who said Sgt. Pepper, but Paul could be revising history. We really don't know what that genesis is.
Well, the way I heard that story is that on the plane, Mal Evans said salt and pepper, but Paul had misheard it as Sgt. Pepper. And of course, his brain went off because at that time, you remember, all the other albums were the mothers of invention. They had all these elongated names. So I'm sure that Paul was influenced by that. But Sgt. Pepper clicked in his brain and it just took off from there, basically.
And Paul's idea was to have an alter ego set up of this band that would be producing these songs, so it really wasn't the Beatles. You're hearing it from the perspective of the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So when this idea came back to John was like, oh, okay, but I think that John was focused on writing songs that didn't necessarily fit within the structure or concept. He was just writing the songs that were important to him, which, as we'll see, were songs that really reminded him of home and his boyhood, and the feeling of what am I looking for? Of remembering times.
Nostalgia, a bit of nostalgia there, but I think that the atmosphere allowed John and the others to totally explore whatever they wanted to. So they weren't restricted to having to write the next hit. It wasn't structured or intended to be that. It was intended to do musically whatever they felt like doing. And remember, this wasn't really a full concept. The concept was just that, but it was very loosely based. So we'll see as we discuss the songs how that developed.
And if you have a chance to have the super deluxe or the deluxe version of this with the book that comes with it, they have pictures of Paul's illustrations of the band. And it's really quite amazing. He's a great artist too, drawing these sketches of what they would look like and the instruments that they're holding. So we'll get to the cover art at the end of this, closer to the end of this podcast. But one of the things, the end of 1966, is that, the Beatles were getting some unfavorable press from what happened in Manila of snubbing the president there, President Marco, I believe.
Imelda Marcos, they had snubbed an event, which they didn't really intend to do. They just didn't think it was something they needed to do. But they took it personally, and then they had a bunch of almost a riot leaving the country.
So they have had, the first time really, some really challenging newspaper articles. And so here they have the comfort of the studio, and Brian Epstein, who is their manager, says, we really need to release a hit single and have a hit single by the end of the year, which would have been December 66. Mm-hmm. And, the Beatles had been riding it hard. They had released Revolver. I mean, it was intense. And so,
Brian Epstein, if I may cut in here, wanted to keep up that pace. In the pop world at that time, if you hadn't released something within a few months, you were already considered blasé history or what's wrong with you. So his mindset was he was getting worried that the Beatles were not getting the continuous exposure they had been getting. So there was that pressure of releasing the single. So these first recordings they did were not intended to be released as singles when they were first recorded. It was basically George Martin's decision to release the first couple of songs that they had recorded, which would probably have been on Sgt. Pepper, and which are Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. And Epstein wanted that hit single. And it was but the beginning of Sgt. Pepper was not Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but it was actually Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. And what were they? They were the two childhood remembrances that one John had, and then Penny Lane was Paul's competitive response. Two beautiful, incredible songs, which we're going to get into, I think, right now.
So for me, Strawberry Fields would be my number one song that I think is so beautiful. I would never change the channel if it comes on. I always try to listen to it all the way through. I think it is it's like a dream to me when I hear it. It takes me to a different place. It's the layers, everything, and the care and the attention that they put into that is amazing. And, I would say that other bands would say, hey, our first version's pretty good. Let's go with that. We're done. Mm-hmm. But not these guys. Constantly listening, making an acetate, listening, having different ideas. Let's do it a different way. And, the Beatles were very fortunate that they were so successful that, EMI gave them the time and the money to be able to have all of these takes and to have all the classical musicians come in. So they were fortunate with that, and they obviously deserved it. Mm-hmm. But Strawberry Fields started off with this simple, beautiful demo that John sang for George Martin, and George Martin loved it, and they started to record it, and not quite where they wanted to go. Jeff, what do you?
Well, the first initial recording of Strawberry Fields was basically starting with a verse and not with a chorus, which we know in the official recording. It was a very simple recording without much overlay, and it was completed in one evening. And then they went back, listened to that, but John wanted something a little different, and they decided they wanted to try a little more aggressive approach to it. They did a much faster second version. And then John says, well, I like the first part of this one, and I like the second part of this one. Can you maybe put those two together? And George Martin, his hair standing up on the back of his neck, thinking, how am I going to pull off this one? Well, in the studio, they were able to at least slow down a track because they ended up being in different keys. The second recording had very aggressive drumming and had brass.
Second recording seemed much quicker.
It was much faster, actually. And so what they did...
And using the vary speed, it was a higher register for John in singing.
Mm-hmm.
And again, George Martin would go to Ken Townsend and say, can you do this? And Ken Townsend was like, I think I would call him the magic man who created the ADT, which is a way to double track John's voice. John always wanted his voice double tracked. And then he was able to figure out how to put these two different versions together and to find the right speed to make it work.
I believe it was about 1 minute in where they did the actual slice. It was flawless. And you'll notice that John's voice sounds a bit dreamier and ethereal. So the effect of basically slowing down one of the, I forget which one is the take one or the second take, and so that the keys would match. Because when they arranged it, like I said, they were in different keys. So then you hear John's voice slowed down slightly, and you still hear all the brass and the aggressive, amazing drumming Ringo performed on that. And you started off with the beautiful ethereal, and they also started the song with the mellotron that Paul plays. So, and they put the chorus at the beginning, another nice little trick that introduced the song with Let Me Take You Down, I'm Going To. So the song that we know is actually two totally different recordings put together. It was brilliant. I love it. I listened to it all the way through, even to the end when you hear them saying cranberry sauce and various other things that have been now mistaken for or misinterpreted by the audience. But it was an amazing recording, and that set the tone, I believe, for the other recordings to come. Are we ready to move into Penny Lane?
Well, I was just going to say at the end of Strawberry Fields, when they bring it back, it's a sound, it's like the horns and everything, and it's like they're circling back.
Mm-hmm.
Very different than from the landscape of other songs at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So while John is reminiscing about Strawberry Fields, by the way, it's Strawberry Field apparently in Liverpool, he added the S. Paul had always taken the bus and would go to, I guess it was a bus depot on Penny Lane.
Right across the street from the actual building, Gothic building, Strawberry Field, which had in the back a huge gardens where you could go hide and relax. It was an escape. And you get that sense of escapism when you listen to the track. The whole thing has that dreamy, surreal quality. And for John, he said, well, surrealism to me is reality. And they achieved that effect in the song. It does have the kind of an eerie, dreamlike quality that takes you somewhere else. It's almost as if you were going into the mind of someone. And it succeeds on that level. And is a great technical achievement for a studio that had only 4 tracks available at the time.
And it goes to George Martin's genius in being frugal with bouncing the tracks and knowing how and when to do that and what the mix would be like. So I can't say enough great things about George Martin.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I was lucky enough to see George Martin in person at the Birchmere in Alexandria, Virginia.
Oh, I didn't know that.
A couple of years before he died, he spoke about Sgt. Pepper. He spoke about the Beatles. It was truly a highlight. But back to Penny Lane. So Penny Lane is Paul's version. And what's interesting to me about this in reading and seeing the notes from Mark Lewison and from this special edition is the number of pianos. I think they had 4 pianos playing, and so the rhythm of this song came to really the pianos driving it. And I think in the mono version that the pianos were bounced to one track, but Giles Martin in the updated version opened it up so that you could hear them. I've heard a few. I don't know that I'm hearing all the pianos, but that's, again, it's the level of detail of adding on. Let's do another piece here. Let's do another piece there. And the lyrics are fantastic.
I believe there's some type of tubular bells then, or tambour. I'm not sure what Ringo's playing on there that you hear, in addition to his percussion. So there was a great deal of innovation on Penny Lane as well. And then they decided they overdubbed the brass, and they overdubbed the piccolo trumpet. I think I saw an interview with the actual player of that described how he played, and it plays all through the end. And a couple of versions also, rare versions exist of Penny Lane. When I first was sitting in the car with my dad on the road somewhere, and on the radio came Penny Lane with a piccolo trumpet sound at the very end. It turned out that was a demo version released to radio stations, but was not included. That little piece at the end was not included on the actual single or final version that came out. So I was deeply frustrated not hearing that part, because the first time you hear something, it leaves an imprint. But it just shows you that the Beatles were never satisfied. They thought, well, that's not the version we really want. So they put out
And again, what we forgot to mention was the amazing Dave Mason, who played the piccolo trumpet after Paul watched him playing a Bach piece on TV.
That's him.
And then quickly brought him in to do this. And if I recall from something that I read, that Paul actually sang that solo or spoke it to him in a way that, this is what I want to hear. And that's what Dave Mason created.
Right. Paul could not actually sit down and write a score, but he could sing the part. And it just shows you how much Paul could hear in his mind and express to the musicians there, and they had musicians capable of pulling that off. It was absolutely beautiful track, a beautiful counterpoint, and I think it's fitting that the two songs were both released as A-sides. What that means, to those of you that don't know, singles were not typically part of albums. They were not used to promote albums at that time. They were separate from albums in those days. And when they put the single out, one side is the side that you play on the radio over and over, and the B side is the other one that's a curiosity. But because both songs were so good, they were both released as A-sides at the same time. Thus, that song came out, and that presaged what was to come.
So at this time, as they're recording this, the Beatles had dabbled in drugs and pot, and they had taken LSD. And by the time they got to Sgt. Pepper, they wanted to back off that. And as Ringo has said, when we were on the substances, our music was shit. So, they wanted to, I think, give their best effort. But at the time, Paul was part of the underground scene in London. There was Carnaby Street. It was wild. And experimental art and avant-garde, and Paul was living in London, whereas John and Ringo and George were out in the suburbs, like in the stockbroker district, and so they were maybe a little jealous of Paul. He was out and about all the time and living large and having this exposure, and all of these influences came in. So when we talk about Sgt. Pepper and we talk about the alter ego, and here as soon as you turn it on, you hear the audience and the orchestra warming up.
I just wanted to quickly mention that John did join Paul, eventually going to some of these underground parties that were held for a year, and they would find places like the Indica Gallery, which is where John had met Yoko. That was actually part of that whole scene. So that's all what led to what was to come. The culture that surrounded them was a year. It lasted about a year of incredible experimentation on many levels, societally. And of course, they were all considered hippies, or not everyone in England was hip to all of this. This was, again, the drug culture influenced them, but they did not want to bring that into the actual recording sessions.
So with Sgt. Pepper, you hear so clearly what a great rock voice Paul has. Amazing. And if you have the chance to watch the making of Sgt. Pepper that featured George Martin, he isolates Paul's voice, and it's just so amazing. And it's the anticipation of what the show's going to be. And you have everyone warming up and excitement, and then here comes this straight rocker that is exciting and thrilling. And as they kind of wind down, they introduce Ringo.
The sound of that Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the first version of it. Basically, it's like West Coast rock, and with the lyrics using English cliches. You're such a lovely audience. We'd like to take you home with us, etc. Paul's amazing rock and roll voice, and then the introduction of crowd noises and crowd laughter, and from the sound effects library, all added to it. And when it was first recorded, there was really no plan to have a segue from that song into the next track. But that was a rocker and very straight ahead. And then of course they overlaid the brass. So, and that's nothing new. The Beatles did introduce brass on Revolver, and but it was going in that direction. But it was the manner in which they set up the album. The first thing you hear in the album is a warm up of violins and orchestra, and the effect of an audience in the background anticipating this hustling this band. So there is the atmosphere that you start with. So you knew when you play the very first track that you're in for something special.
And when you hear Sgt. Pepper, the first song, Lonely Hearts Club Band, the drums, the way that Jeff Emmerich recorded Ringo's drums, it's like in your face. It's amazing. It is, it's just exceptional. And I think they used to use maybe 3 to 4 mics on his drum set, and Emmerich increased it to 7 mics. So you're really getting that dynamic of how he plays, and he is the cornerstone. That backbeat is just amazing. And so when we get to, with a little help from my friends, John and Paul would always write a song for Ringo. And so they wrote this song, and I think that it was called Badfinger Boogie for a little bit, which is so ironic because later on with the group Badfinger, it must have been something in their normal chatting that they would always say Badfinger, which is,
Yeah, that was the original working title of it. It was written specifically for Ringo. All is basically 5 notes. It's a limited range and a key. And it was another one of those made-to-order songs, which doesn't really sound like one when you hear it, but it's extremely catchy. It has Ringo's specific vocal signature and has little joke lines like, I can't tell you, but I know it's mine. And then you would have other artists cover that song. Later it was Joe Cocker, I believe, except that he was a bit more overt, saying, it sure feels like mine. So there's a very interesting history of that. And the first lines is, what would you think if I sang on a tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me? Well, that wasn't the original line. The original line was, would you stand up and throw tomatoes at me? Yes. And Ringo absolutely refused to sing that line. He wanted that taken out. So they changed the line, stand up and walk out on me. And I'm glad he did, because that would have been extremely awkward. And the reason he asked him to change it is because the audience, when the Beatles were touring, would be throwing jelly beans, because the Beatles said they liked jelly beans. They'd be throwing them at them and they would hurt. And the last thing he wanted was, just in case they went back to tour again, he did not want audience members throwing tomatoes at the stage.
Well, Ringo was very hesitant about his voice. And if I recall correctly, as they were recording this, it might have been something like 5 a.m. And Ringo's like, I'm going home. And they're like, what? No, you're not. Come back here. You're going to do this vocal. And they said, I'm just knackered. I need to go home. And they kept him there, and they did the vocal. And Ringo was very concerned he couldn't get the final high note. And that Paul, and they're like, come on, Ringo, you can do it. You can do it. And he did get that high note, which was a stretch. But it's my favorite Ringo song. It's a great song. It's a great bass. by Paul on that, who at the time was overdubbing his bass and his Rickenbacker into a directly into the board, the mixing board, which is different. And Jeff Emmerich would put a mic by one of the amps. He'd double it up, but really, for the most part, it was direct injection.
That's how they get the bass sound. And if you listen to the stereo tracks, you hear a lot of times the bass isolated on one side when they did the stereo mix. The bass sounds absolutely incredible. And another note is, unlike other bass players, Paul would like to overdub his bass later in the recording process because he wanted to hear how everything else sounded so he could create a melodic bass line. It was extremely innovative.
And again, unique playing, wild playing. And what's interesting about the album is that the time in between the tracks is less than what songs and albums were in previous years. So you're not waiting for it. It's just kind of more of that seamless flow. So then we move into Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And as many of you know, or maybe you don't know if you're new to the Beatles, is that the people at the time felt that this was a secret message about using LSD. LSD, the initials.
An acronym, LSD, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Of course, that was totally the opposite of the truth. At the time, John Lennon has a son named Julian. A lot of you know who Julian Lennon is. Well, Julian was about 5 years old, and as children will, they like to draw images of people who think they can fly. So they're in the sky, and he literally drew a childhood drawing of Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Click. John Lennon went, okay, there's a song out of that.
And by the way, Lucy is a real person, another student who passed away from lupus a few years ago.
Oh, I didn't know about that. Wow. Well, so it's a real person, and every Beatles gone in and denied that, and it's not because they're uncomfortable with drug references. Everybody knew that they experimented with drugs, but that's not what that song was about at all.
And the song was heavily influenced by John's appreciation of Alice in Wonderland.
Heavily influenced by Lewis Carroll. Is his literature. He read Jabberwocky, Alice in Wonderland. This was recorded in 4 consecutive nights, and with John and Paul both singing together on the chorus. There's unison and there's harmony. Beautifully done. George Harrison was just played on the song, but he did not sing on it. And in the intro, you hear the Lowry organ. It's not a harpsichord. It's just an organ with a harpsichord and music box setting on the organ. And that's how they achieved that dreamy effect at the beginning, that beautiful melodic intro. And John's vocal, he experimented with that vocal a number of times. And it just, it just takes you, again, to another place.
And the lyrics are amazing. They're reflective of the time, the psychedelic, the hippies coming on board, all of that free-flowing stream of consciousness kind of ideas and very visual images.
Well, that was in the literature at the time, like poets like E. Cummings, and John was influenced by all of that, but I think it's mostly trying to recreate a Lewis and Carroll fantasy. So John was writing plasticine porters and looking back ties, and it was beautifully written.
And what I do like that the partnership of John and Paul, with Paul singing Lucy in the Sky, really primarily you hear his voice, and it's nice that it's totally working together as a group and as a team. And so...
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I can't say enough about Lucy in the Sky. I could talk this whole podcast about Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And let's not forget that it was never released as a Beatles single, but later John's friend Elton John recovered it in 1974, and they'd made a bet that Elton said, if this gets to number 1, you're getting on stage with me. And John thought, oh, no way this is ever going to be number 1. Well, it did reach number 1, and the historic meeting of John Lennon later appearing in Madison Square Garden with Elton performing that song. So it just shows you the influence that this song has had since then.
So in talking about getting better, which is, I would say it's a John and Paul song because they worked on it, if I recall correctly, at Paul's house in London.
Yes.
And you can hear the optimism of Paul. It's getting better all the time. And then you can hear John's contribution. It couldn't get much worse.
Couldn't get no worse.
No
right?
worse. You know, that's so fitting to them. And it is I love the song. I love the simplicity of it. I always get a little, I find it interesting, the one, I used to be cruel to my woman. I beat her and took her apart from the things that she loved.
Yeah, kept her apart from the things that she loved.
Is that a John influence? Is that a Paul? You know, we don't know.
It's mostly Paul's song, actually. I don't know if that's John, but the line, although in today's context it sounds almost horrid, I used to be cruel to my woman, I beat her. But it's not, I don't think it's an admission. It's just, it's about a character in the song saying, I'm changing for the better. And the phrase getting better actually came from a substitute drummer for Ringo when Ringo was sick for about 10 days.
Jimmy Nicol.
Jimmy Nichols kept saying, it's getting better all the time. And that's what stimulated the lyric. I don't know about the other history behind that lyric. I think in the recording of it, there's a specific type of harmonium or a kind of sound that comes out of it when they go into that bridge that underlies that piece. Do you recall who was playing that? Was that?
I don't.
I think maybe Paul or George Martin. But there's, again, unusual sounds they went, but they showed to underline the darkness that was before in the bridge, coming back to the positivity.
Optimism
Of the song.
And similarly is Fixing a Hole, which is one of my favorites. And I love the idea of, taking the time really to sort yourself. That's kind of how I feel the song is. It's doing what you need to sort your head, to get your head in a better place. I'm fixing a hole where the rain.
For the number of things that weren't important yesterday, but I still go. Those are some of the lines from the song. And again, people were interpreting, because of the drug culture, fixing is associated with heroin. Of course, it had nothing to do with that at all. Paul was literally fixing something in his home, and fixing a hole is exactly what he was doing. The lyric was much more literal. It's also interesting to note in the recording of the song that this was the one song that was not recorded at EMI Studios because it was booked at the time. It was done at Regent Sound Studios into a crammed little space. And on that song, you hear a harpsichord, which was George Martin performing as a musician on Fixing a Hole. And the great guitar work on that by George Harrison was on his Fender Stratocaster. It was a great recording. And again, you have George Martin playing band member.
Handling the parts that were challenging and that gave it the right feeling. And so here are the Beatles. They're so open to getting what they want to hear and to getting the best version that they could do. And that is, talk about perseverance, talk about dedication, working long hours. And, interesting with Fixing a Hole, it's like the idea of people not coming in. To him, it's like, no wonder people can't come in. I'm like, can't remember the lyrics.
They worry me, but they worry me, but they never wonder why they can't get past my door. That's where the song has a little bit of bite. At first it says, okay, I'm cool, everything's great, I'm in my space. But, they worry me and never get past my door. And I think he's probably referring to the fans that stood outside his house every day and other various people. And he's saying in this song, no, I am retreating into my personal space. I'm going to find my peace here. I'm going to fix this hole. And fixing a hole is kind of symbolic for, again, like you said at the beginning, finding your own peace.
Self-awareness.
Self-awareness.
It's really way ahead of his time.
Right.
And
finding one's personal peace. Nobody knew really what to make of that in the beginning. But it's a great track with a great contributions by all the Beatles involved.
So with that, we move on to She's Leaving Home. And I will say that it's probably the song that I listen to the least of all the songs. I can't describe it. Sometimes it feels like it's a little out of tune to me, and it's probably, one of the innovations for this album is that they were constantly toying with the speeds of the recording and slowing things up, slowing things down, and it just sounds a little flat. I don't know how to describe it. It's
Perhaps you're referring to John's vocal, "We didn't know it was wrong." That's because of the unusual string part that was arranged on that particular song. She's Leaving Home is actually based upon a true story. An only child, a 17-year-old named Melanie Coe, had run away, and there was a newspaper article in which Paul had read. But at the time Paul was stimulated by that article, he was totally unaware that he'd actually met Melanie Coe in 1963 on a BBC dance show called Ready, Set, Go, where she was in a lip-syncing contest and Paul was a judge. The Beatles had performed 3 songs, then Paul judged the contest, and that Melanie Coe had actually won an album on that contest. But back to the actual recording of it, Paul wanted to write George Martin to write a score, but George Martin had another session for that time with another artist. I think it was Cilla Black, and so he was unavailable. And Paul was impatient and contacted another arranger named Mike Leander, who wrote the score. And then, but of course, George Martin had conducted the sessions, and that was always a sore point with George Martin for not having the opportunity to write that score.
Imagine that you are producing and working with the Beatles on this, and God forbid for one day you can't do that, and here Paul goes out and gets someone else. It had to hurt, and really smart, and I feel kind of sorry for sweet, gentle George Martin to these egos. It's like, we've got to have it now, and I'm sure that Paul was thinking, I need to get it now while it's still fresh in my mind. I don't want to lose my groove.
Well, George Martin actually did love the score. I think it was just it wasn't a major hurt from him. It was, again, Paul's impatience. He had the inspiration and the mojo. He wanted to get it going. And I think the lyrics are really beautiful. You feel sympathy for all the characters except for the man at the motor trade. You feel for the parents who would...
And who was the man at the motor trade? They said in the past that might have been about abortion, but I don't know that that's so true.
No, because the following line is, she is having fun. So apparently it was... We don't really know what that means. I don't know what motor trade means. But you have sympathy for all the characters. I mean, the only child who's lonely and has everything, seems to have everything. The parents that are totally bewildered. What did we do that was wrong?
This is a lyric that tells a story, that paints the picture. It's from things that are happening at the time, where youngsters are maybe leaving home and in search of freedom. Mm-hmm. All of these things happening. So here's a song that totally captures the moment.
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally. But I also think it can be related to today. I personally love the track because the vocal on it, Paul's vocal is very beautiful. Some of the what you were citing earlier was a purposeful discordant string arrangement in the third part because reveals the consternation of the family and the parents. So I thought it was a very moving track. It's actually one of my personal favorites.
Well, you see, there's a lid for every pot, right?
That's right.
So, moving on to one of the most amazing tracks, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. And legend has it that I think it was George and John went into an antique shop, and John found this poster. I'm sorry, no, that is the poster.
Mm-hmm. They were indeed looking through antique shops, and it was a poster that John took home to his house in Surrey and put on the wall.
And it's all the lyrics are taken almost right from that poster, but he's tweaked them. And again, he's culled together this whole little story, this whole little very interesting song.
Well, what he did to tweak the lyrics, he at first dismissed it as, oh, I just copied this off a poster. There wasn't that much into it. But later in 1980, he changed his mind about it. And John would say to his interviewers, well, I think this song is cosmically beautiful and pure, like a painting or watercolor. He took the lyric, like, for instance, Xanthus the horse. Well, that is awkward to sing Xanthus, so it became Henry the horse. Adjustments like that, it made the song his own. And he told George Martin in the sessions, well, I want to actually hear the sawdust. Now, what's interesting about the recording of Mr. Kite is the use of the harmonium, the Lowry organ, the mellotron, glockenspiel. George Martin was looking to bring in a steam organ, which is what John wanted, but the steam organ was too large and they couldn't fit it into the studio. So instead they found tapes of steam organ. They would cut up the tape, throw it up in the air, and then put the pieces together to create some of that sound. And then you also had a bass harmonica. Now, I'm not quite sure what a bass harmonica is or what it sounds like, but you had multiple people playing the bass harmonica for the effect they wanted to achieve, which was George Harrison, roadies Neil Aspinall, Mal Evans, and John was playing the Hammond organ. So the way all of that came together is just absolutely a recording feat I cannot imagine.
And what George Martin described is that they wanted to get the Rudy Tooty feeling of being at the circus. And the bass harmonicas, George Martin was very familiar with, because I think that there was an English group that, and I don't recall the name, but they would go on those shows and have all their harmonicas and be playing their harmonicas. It was
I remember reading about that, right.
So, again, taking the influences and looking for whatever loops, whatever ways of doing things, and even like Strawberry Fields, I believe it's the backwards hi-hat that they recorded. All of this innovation and trying different techniques to deliver what they wanted. Hours and hours working, hundreds of takes. They've changed how they were doing songs, and they had started to do that with Revolver, but they really made this their. I mean, it's just amazing to me, their work ethic, like going to work every day and to be creative and to constantly be aware and listening and changing. Something interesting that I was reading was Ringo, and what George Martin said about Ringo, Ringo would tell John, no, that's crap. And John would like pull his glasses down and go, oh, really? And make some snide remark or some cutting remark, but then he would incorporate what Ringo would say. And Paul would do the same thing, that even though Ringo spent a lot of his time, and as he said, it was kind of boring for me. I learned how to play chess during Sgt. Pepper. Ringo, and you can just see this with his personality, that Ringo probably just telling it like it is, that really sucks. Which is what they can say to each other.
Right.
And, Paul listening and saying, oh, okay, we can do it better this time. It's the dynamic between the group.
Well, they could accept criticism from one another. They obviously listened to one another. Which leads us to this next track, the most unusual. And I think a lot of the fans had mixed reviews when it first came out, saying, oh, it's just dreadful and horrible. It's called Within You, Without You. And George Harrison at that time was still having his India hangover. They had taken a trip to see Maharishi. They'd been to India.
No, that was 68.
Oh, that was 68. I'm sorry.
George had gone to India by himself to learn how to play sitar.
With Ravi Shankar.
That's right.
Ravi Shankar. Well, and so he had India on his mind, and he wanted to try this. So this was basically a George Harrison solo song with George Martin, with the tacit approval of the rest of the band. John Lennon particularly loved the song because he said that this was a pure expression from George. It's complete in and of itself. And also it's a bit of a sequel to a song called Love You Too from Revolver, which also had sitar on it. So this was expanded to have that influence. Of course, George was playing sitar on it, and all the parts that George sings are also matched by the string arrangement, which was not played by Indian musicians, but by the London Symphony Orchestra, and then separately the Asian music circles. So there were no other Beatles on this recording. But
I think it's an amazing song. It's one of my most favorite songs ever. I love the rhythm of it and the I'm not going to even try to pronounce the Indian instruments.
I'm not going to attempt at all to name a single Indian instrument on this because I don't know what they're called. I'd have to look them up, and I'm not going to sit here and look
written them out. Swarmandella.
Swarmandella, that's it.
Sound.
Have you practiced your Swarmandella today? I don't think so.
But the vocal mirrors what the I thought it was the Indian violins that were doing that whatever. So, and it's a song that no one would ever expect to be on a rock and roll album. And so people are listening to this and they're going, what? But if you really listen to it, and if you have the chance to read their lyrics, it is a simply beautiful song that captures George's essence and his metamorphosis into someone who is more spiritual, where whatever he did when he went to India, it clicked that first trip.
Well, he said himself that he was bored with being fab, the Beatles being fabulous and fab. He had moved beyond that, and so appearing to work for the Beatles became more of a job for him at that point, and he openly admitted that. I think that George Martin, though, was extremely versatile and sensitive as a producer to bring that to light, to make the London Symphony Orchestra and the Asian Music Circle to perform this with the Indian musical signatures and concept that George brought with this tune. It's a little masterpiece contained in this album. It's like an oasis. It's unlike anything I've ever heard before or since.
And what's interesting, I think they ended the track with laughter, which they wanted to say, don't take it too seriously. It's just us. This is our song. And it's such a touching thing. It's the down-to-earth quality of the Beatles.
Well, they openly acknowledged, George said, well, it's the end of a sad song, but let's lighten up a bit. And that sets the stage for the next track, which is the ever-famous, wonderful, vaudevillian When I'm 64, which is actually written when Paul was about, 16 years old?
Paul had said that he envisioned himself writing for Sinatra or writing for big band people or these big songs. And so his father played the big band music, and Paul was so influenced by his dad and wrote this as a song to fill in when they played live in Hamburg and the Cavern. Probably a very rough version.
Well, it was written before his awareness of rock and roll. So he thought, what a perfect piece to bring out onto this record with its vaudevillian influence, its Victorian music hall feel, which is not the last time Paul would attempt to write such a piece, but it showed that he could write outside of the rock and roll genre and the typical ballad genre. And they arranged it beautifully with 2 clarinets and a bass clarinet on it. Again, Ringo is playing Tubular Bells, which is actually the title of a song in the future by some other artist for The Exorcist. But Tubular Bells is a real instrument, and Ringo plays that on that album, on that song.
And with Paul, they sped up the song so that his voice would be a little bit higher to capture the more youthful energy, and it's the sense of young versus old within this,
right?
What happens.
It was actually written in the key of C and raised up to B flat. So that effect was achieved, and again, that's part of the recording innovation. It's a great little piece, and I think George Martin even had given it and intended it to be used for another artist in his roster.
Well, I do prefer the take on the one of the alternate takes where the voice is at the regular speed, and I don't know that the voice has been double tracked yet. I think it's charming. It
on the
speaks
deluxe
to me
version.
a little bit more than the original version.
I can't emphasize to you fans out there, if you can get the deluxe version, you will get to hear all the various stages of recording of these songs and hear them as they were originally recorded in the original speeds before they were adjusted for final release. It's a fascinating excavation of how this musical adventure had come together.
And when you listen to those alternate takes, you get a sense of how much fun they're having just through their banter. And there's more banter on the deluxe version, the 50th anniversary version, than there is on the anthology. On the anthology, I wish that they had numbered the takes better or been a little more generous in some of the things that maybe they cut out. But again, it makes it so much more interesting and fun to listen to when you hear how they're moving these songs forward. So, Lovely Rita, again, they had Meter Maids in London.
The next song, Lovely Rita, Meter Maid.
Meter Maid. And so Paul is writing this story. And initially, I think he said it was going to be a song of hate.
Right.
And then he changed his mind.
Here's the reason why. Parking used to be free in London. And at that time, they decided to introduce parking fees, parking meters. And so the meter maids were brought out and issuing tickets. And of course, people resentful of that. Nobody liked it. And so Paul's inclination, well, maybe you should write a song critical of meter maids. But instead, he wanted to make it about love. So you have this bashful character asking Rita for a date, and they have dinner. And then sitting on the sofa with a sister or two, he is frustrated. And he doesn't get where he's going, but he gets to see her again. So it's basically a love song, an unusual love song to a meter maid. And of course, there was some truth behind this. Paul did actually see a rather attractive meter maid. I don't think he actually approached her. I think that's just a story he made up. And something else I found fascinating about the song, to make it more playful, because they wanted something up and positive and for the album, was the playful kazoo effect that's on it.
With a comb.
Toilet paper and combs. And all four Beatles were playing toilet paper and combs to achieve that effect. And of course, there were jokes going around about the width of toilet paper. Is it the right thickness, etc.? It's hysterically funny, but I thought they were using kazoos before I found out they were using this. And then you have this incredible piano solo that at first I thought was Paul playing, but that was George Martin on that piano solo in the middle of the song. So go listen to Lovely Rita, Meter Maid. The background vocals are great. You can hear John there.
And the bass is wild. I mean, it is free-flowing, crazy. Some may say maybe it's a tiny bit sloppy, but it's that frenetic. I love watching bass covers of people trying to cover it on YouTube, of hitting it, and it's very tricky. I mean, Paul had his own style. He wasn't a studied musician. He had incredible feel, but it was his feel. And the swing, I would describe it as having swing, that bass line.
It did.
Having
It's
swing.
a very swinging bass part, and
it makes the song. It's very hard to replicate.
You can replicate, and part of the reason it's difficult to replicate is if you're not left-handed like Paul is. It's pretty hard to achieve that same effect. But again,
left-handed?
Well, he's left-handed.
Well, I don't understand that.
Well, playing the bass left-handed is different than playing a right-handed bass, I would imagine. Am I wrong about that? You know more about bass than I do, Karen, so you tell me.
I don't know about that. Playing bass on the neck is playing bass, so...
Okay, never mind.
Listen, the only comment I would say is I always think that maybe he was way high when he was recording that bass, because that's the feeling that I get. It's like, woo!
Possibly. I'm not going to go there.
Onward to Good Morning, Good Morning.
Good morning, good morning. This is John's song, basically about his boring suburban life in Surrey, which was... a rich neighborhood outside of London, filled with bankers and stockbrokers and a TV show called Meet the Wife, and the lyrics betray John's boredom with that life. And it was initiated by a catalog cereal commercial. It said, "Good morning." And so he took the lyrics, "Nothing to do, save his life, call his wife in. Nothing to say, but what a day. How's your boy been?" The lyrics portray absolute utter boredom. Except at the very end, he gets a little naughty and he say, "Go to a show, you hope she goes." He goes out. He wants to get out and get away from it. I think that was hinting at John's, not only his boredom with that life, he felt like he was just a passenger, passing into a place where he didn't really belong.
But I think it goes to who John is, which is needing constant stimulation, needing change perhaps. And here he's locked into the big home, the wife, the child, and
the things you're trained to think that you want, but he ended up not really wanting that. I think that was the beginning of the end of his relationship with Cynthia. I think everyone knew his first wife, Cynthia Lennon, the son they had is Julian. And that marriage was already in trouble, I believe. And this was his song about that. Not directly, of course, but all the lines in it indicate, I've got to get out of this. Go to a show, you hope she goes.
So on one of the alternate takes on the deluxe package, you can hear Paul kind of going, "Good morning, good morning," and he's kind of getting into the rhythm because the song is rhythmically, it really chugs forward. You really get a sense of great, I don't know how to say this, it's just, it's blast right at you.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's very upfront. But the song actually rocks. If you listen to Ringo's aggressive drumming on it, it's some of the most creative drumming that I've heard. And then the brass added to this song. You have 3 saxophones, 2 trombones, and a French horn. And then, of course, at the very end of the song, you have animal noises galore. We can talk about that. The animal noises are in sequence. One animal that can get eaten by another animal that gets eaten by another animal. And at
least scared.
Scared, right. And at the very end of it, you hear a cockerel. And we'll get into that when we go into the next track. But that cockerel effect allowed George Martin to create a segue into a guitar. The cockerel sounded almost like a guitar. And remember, the way this album was spaced out is that there's virtually no space between the tracks. Most albums made prior to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band had about a second or two between each song. But that's not the case here. The illusion of a concept album, basically the album was strung together by eliminating the segues between songs and creating these little pieces where one song would lead into another. And the effects that they used, from the EMI archives, created that effect, and which leads us into Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band Reprise.
Well, before we start that, I was just going to say that actually Paul plays lead, I want to say, on Good Morning lead guitar.
Mm-hmm.
And he also did it, I'd have to double check my notes, I think it's Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite.
Mm-hmm.
But he really took a role, and you can hear his influence. He plays his leads in a very similar fashion. But we get to the reprise, which is, here Sgt. Pepper, the alternate band, has brought you to the show, has introduced you to Billy Shears. Then you've heard all these songs, and now we're going to bring it back and to reintroduce them before really the finale of this wonderful show. And again, I would highly recommend you listen to the alternate takes for this, and you can hear Paul specifically telling Ringo, on your bass drum, really hit it, boom, bah, boom, bah, and instructing him to get that crushing dynamic of the drums, and then Ringo going, well, that's what I'm doing, and Paul kind of backs off. There's a sweetness about Paul. It's like he wants his way. It's, oh, okay, I'm back in. Okay, I hear it. Maybe I didn't hear maybe I'm interfering or something. It was just, it's very,
Being diplomatic.
yes.
Paul had that charm to accomplish what he wanted. But originally, the Pepper reprise was not planned until they heard from, again, one of the roadies, so in the Beatles' assistants named Neil Aspinall. It was really his idea to have a kind of a segue. And then John Lennon approaches him and says, "You are really kind of a bit of a smart ass, aren't you?" And that's when Neil, and laughing and winking at him, and that's when Neil knew that they would actually use his idea to create the reprise. It's also the very last song that was recorded for the Sgt. Pepper sessions, and they were in a hurry because Paul had to go to America in 2 days. So they spent an 11-hour stretch of work to record this song. It was the last one recorded. And again,
A Day in the Life.
A day in the last song that was recorded. Not the last song on the album, but the last one they recorded. The next song, A Day in the Life, was actually recorded earlier, I believe, in the Sgt. Pepper sessions. It was done in, I believe, in January of 1967, which included a 40-piece orchestra, which George Martin recorded a number of times, actually, to achieve the effect.
Just to interject, Paul wanted a full orchestra, and a full orchestra is about 90 players. And again, the expense, where George Martin has to monitor the expense. And it's like, I think I can do this with this amount of people. So
to save money, basically, he was able to use the studio and basically record those 40 musicians a couple of times, and then use those to create the illusion of a 90-piece orchestra. And the reason that they needed the orchestra to begin with is because you have actually two entirely separate songs. John Lennon's beautiful piece, I Read the News Today, Oh Boy. And then they put that together with Paul's part, which is Woke Up, Fell Out of Bed, that little ditty. But they had a 24-beat segue, and it was blank. And if you listen to the recordings on the deluxe album, you hear it's just the piano playing a chord, sustaining it, and you hear Mal Evans counting off up to 24 bars. They had to fill that 24 bars with something. So that's when they came up with the idea of this orchestra with this crescendo, which ends in a giant E chord. And then at the very end of the track, you hear multiple pianos, Paul, John, Ringo, George Martin, and roadie Mal Evans, all at the same time playing a sustained E chord, a very haunting and long ending. They let it sustain out to the very end. But the brilliance of that piece, making into centerpieces, putting these two songs together, how they fit together as one work, is just beyond. And John's voice just on that song just gives me chills.
And again, the BBC or whomever, they banned A Day in the Life. They banned With a Little Help from My Friends and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds for potential drug influences.
Oh, they banned A Day in the Life because of the line, "I'd love to turn you on," which is actually Paul's little line. That was his little segue. But I thought it was a beautiful line, but they both looked at each other knowing it could be interpreted incorrectly. But the banning of that didn't actually hurt them at all. In fact, it probably, because of the culture surrounding them, made people more curious. Nowadays, of course, it's ridiculous. They weren't really hinting. Turn you on could mean any number of things, but because there were letters going back and forth panicking at EMI, well, we think this doesn't represent EMI. It could have been innocent, but it possibly refers to the drug culture. Therefore, we, with our standards, cannot air that. Well, this
song, again, points to John reading the paper, an article about I believe Tara Brown, the Guinness heir who died in a car crash. Mm-hmm. And John has said, no, it really wasn't about him, but it has a similar feel. He took it and made it his own. And Paul's piece, Woke Up, Fell Out of Bed, about his time of running out to catch the bus, probably down to the Penny Lane bus depot, but really fabulous. And the cool thing, if you can watch the video of this, of when they brought in the classical musicians, and the Beatles had requested that these very, very famous and renowned musicians dress in evening wear or black tie. So here they come in, and the Beatles had told George Martin, "Oh, we're going to dress in black tie too." Of course they didn't. They're wearing their brightly colored outfits, their crazy colors. They've invited Marianne Faithfull, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Mike Nesmith from the Monkees is there. The wives are there. I mean, they wanted to make it a happening because that's the whole scene at the time in London, which is everything was a happening. There were pop-up shows, all kind of goodies. And so they look quite baked at this big thing.
Oh, yeah.
And Paul is like, has a red apron on, and he's trying to conduct, I'm sure. I don't know what they're thinking, but the Beatles brought joke items for the orchestra to wear, like red rubber noses.
Yeah, prophylactics to put on your nose, and is utterly
so
ridiculous.
Red rubber ball.
For these extremely conservative violin players, had to wear this and still perform, which they
to their credit,
did.
they wore it, and they
wore
like
it.
They were having fun.
They were good. They were good about it, but the trumpet players were the most adventurous when it came to the climbing note to the concert. So you find all the character in the various members of the orchestra to make that piece happen.
And one of the things with what George Martin said was to build this orchestral climax. This just like building and starting from the lowest note to the highest note. Well, that's a wide open parameter. There had to be some type of steppage, which George Martin was able to provide to them, that certain people had to be in certain places to get to that.
Right. It was loosely guided. Right. It was loosely guided. But another piece of some of the lyrics, 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire, that's actually referring to all the potholes that were around at the time, and everyone made hay of the lyrics. The lyrics were wide open to interpretation after the fact. Somebody spoke, and I had a smoke, and somebody spoke, and I went into a dream. That's Paul's line. Well, what was that about? What kind of smoke was he smoking? So there were some references, and I think they deliberately left that in and for audience interpretation. And again, the whole thing is like a dream piece. I fell into a dream, and then you hear John's haunting in the background singing his ah part, and you get a sense that the whole album is like, here's the dream of the alternate band, and now we're coming to the finale of that dream, and with the final chord fading out, now we're all going to wake up from that dream. And that's how the album tenuously fits together. All these disparate, separately written songs were tied together by effects, tied together by the experimentation, tied together by its own diversity, tied together with the reprise, and
with the run out groove, which we'll quickly hit, which is they were fascinated by frequencies and how humans couldn't hear certain frequencies, and so they wanted this run out groove, which is at the end of a vinyl record. You have to basically pick up the arm back in those days to stop the record. So they wanted something to play out. And on the English version, they had it. They had some loops, interesting stuff. And Paul had said, I want that if a dog hears it, the dog's going to start barking, and then the owner's going to know what in the world's going on. Well, it's the end of the album. The English version didn't have it. Ultimate and subsequent versions did have it. And one of the naughty...
The American version didn't have it. The English version did.
But ultimately it did. The American versions did get it in later years, I believe.
Right.
But it's the naughty rumor about it is that if you play it backwards, the conspiracy theorists say if you play it backwards, it says, "We will F you like Superman." So here are all these people ruining their turntables by trying to play it.
Yeah,
trying to play it backwards.
And guess what? I was one of them. I was listening through Strawberry Fields just to hear what they were saying, and I was taking Revolution 9 from another album and playing that backwards. Yes, a lot of us took the grooves of our original copies and purposefully tried to find out what those clues meant and took them seriously and played them backwards, yes.
And again, and that's the fun. And when we look at we'll quickly cover the cover art, which was the amazing picture that Peter Blake designed, who was an avant-garde artist, and all the work that they had to get into to get the permission for the people to be on the picture, people who had to be whited out because they wouldn't want to do that, and
or found to be inappropriate. There are some that were turned down.
And
right, it was one of the most expensive album cover done at the time, and Peter Blake did not want to make it as an album cover, but in his view, as a piece of art. Well, that piece of art cost the Beatles about £3,000 at that time, which is about maybe $5,000 in US dollars, which could actually buy a house. So, and what did they normally spend on album covers at that time? About £100. So,
again, the Beatles had the luxury of having whatever they wanted to happen.
Not necessarily, because EMI said to Brian Epstein, well, if this album sells 1 million copies, we'll pay for it. Otherwise, you pay for it.
And I think that Brian Epstein was very concerned, and he had written a little note that said, brown paper bags for Sgt. Pepper.
Mm-hmm.
And here you have this magnificent cover in their costumes with the wax figures of the Beatles, who are, the Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band, then the Beatles, then their idols, Elvis, Tony Curtis, a whole bunch. And you open it up, and on the gatefold sleeve is this fabulous picture of the Beatles where they're looking right at the camera, which is something that they purposely did, is as if they were looking right at you. Initially, it was going to be a design by the group called The Fool, which were artists, and Robert Fraser, who was involved in helping the Beatles move this forward, said no, that
that inner sleeve was designed for them to look at the camera with a look of saying, I love you, audience. That was the intent behind that. But back to the actual front cover of it, I think Mae West, Siren Mae West, was refused it at first because I'm not in any Lonely Hearts Club. And then they persuaded her to be on the record. On the cover of the record, as they did many other people. Also, there's the plants that are in front of the Beatles. Many people misinterpreted those plants to be marijuana plants, but they're actually called peperomia plants, which are not marijuana. The album cover, it actually won an award. The 1968 Grammy Awards, it won Best Album Cover for Graphic Arts. So that should tell you right there how much effort was put into the packaging of it. And also they wanted to include inside the album some sweets and stuff, and EMI didn't want that, so they opted for the cardboard cutouts, Sgt. Board little presents that were inside the sleeve when you bought the record. And
for those not familiar, it's like you could cut out Sgt. Pepper's mustache. There were like the stripes on the uniform, cool things like that. And then when you flip it over, this is the first album that actually had all of the lyrics to the songs, which the song publishers were not happy about because they were concerned that it would cut into buying sheet music.
Yes.
By doing this. And so, again, the Beatles are setting the pace by how they're thinking globally of putting this idea together.
Absolutely. And basically, the Beatles want to include all their heroes. John Lennon wanted to include Jesus Christ and Hitler for obvious reasons. That was a fanciful notion. It did not make the album cover. When there was any type of censorship, they would either paint over the person that did not want to be on the cover, or they'd put a plant in front of them. But the rest had cardboard cutouts. George Harrison had many people he wanted on, like Leo Dorsey. I think wanted some money for it, and they said, forget that. They had put all the heroes of the culture at the time in the audience. Basically, the question was, who are the people you would want in your audience? So each Beatle got to contribute that to it. And I thought the wax figures of the Beatles from 1964 in their conservative suit and tie looking on at Sgt. Pepper's, and the amount of work that had gone into making that album cover. Anyway,
and again, the costumes were made specifically by, I think it was the Berman costumers in London. And just a couple of years ago, they might have recreated those suits and put them on an exhibition over there. And I would have loved to have seen that. That would have been awesome.
Well, Paul would wanted this to happen because he would love to look at album covers while he was sitting on the bus for about 30 minutes. And he thought, well, why don't I get an album cover that people can look at for months? and still want to go back and look at it and think about it and figure it out. But it's not the first time they were innovative with album covers. Previous albums like Revolver had Klaus Vormann's combination of drawing and photos. So they were already upping the game for not only creating the album cover as a piece of art and fascination, but tying the whole newness of what they were creating together. I think putting that together is what gave everyone the illusion that it was actually a concept album, although it was a very loose concept, but it actually evolved into a concept album in the end.
Well, when you think about Sgt. Pepper, and at that time of June 1967, the Summer of Love, getting into the Summer of Love, that this is an album that was played by everybody, that if you were walking down the street, you would hear it in someone's apartment. Everyone was turned on by it. It was just overwhelming that everybody was, drinking the Kool-Aid of Sgt. Pepper, but it was because it was so different. And it set the tone for other groups, as in Pink Floyd, influenced them perhaps to make the Dark Side of the Moon, other ideas, and it really highlighted and illustrated the Summer of Love, which is this positivity of happiness, of freedom, all of those things encompass.
But they weren't really looking to do that. I think they just kind of accidentally placed in there. The album, and I've read reviews about this, where the album in and of itself, nothing else was like it. You had Surrealistic Pillow, you had all these other albums out there that are more evocative of the time, arguably, than Sgt. Pepper was, because Sgt. Pepper was both in it, but out of it. It was not quite the definitive. It became a symbol to some people of the Summer of Love, but it really wasn't intended for that. It was just the Beatles in their own expression, and everyone was buying it because they were the Beatles. But the experimentation was going on anyway amongst other bands, I think, and the Beatles just kicked it up a notch. And then that instigated the further experimentation you're referring to. But I think the album really, by itself, it stands alone because look at it. It wasn't intending to make drug references on purpose. It wasn't intending to change the culture. It was just their expression of saying, okay, we want to open up ourselves musically. This is our expression. This is the continuation of Pet Sounds. And culturally, what was happening around them, yes, were they influenced by their culture around them? Yes. But the culture around them did not make them write the songs that they wrote. I think that they were just...
It was a reflection of what was happening.
It was a reflection, right, rather than, not just it wasn't reactionary in any way. It was just them delving into their own minds and finding out what they wanted to write about.
So in wrapping things up, this album is Rolling Stone's most influential album of all time. I think that's pretty accurate. I think it's a good one to have. And I will just say, we were talking about this the other day, that Lou Reed was never a fan of Sgt. Pepper. In fact, he thought that the benefit of Mr. Kite was a shit song. So whatever, Lou Reed, okay.
With all due respect to
the late Lou Reed.
To the late Lou Reed and you Lou Reed fans out there, I did like a couple of Lou Reed songs, but I disagree with him very strongly about it.
And most would. So we've kind of gone over our projected hour time, but this happens. This is such a monumental album. We love it so much. It's such an influence on us and the clean recording technique, the innovation, everything that they did. The lyrics, phenomenal.
I think we could literally spend 3 or 4 podcasts on this album alone and go into more minutia than you could possibly want to hear. But yes, you definitely should have this in your collection. If you're new to the Beatles, this is essential. And
if you're an old fan like we are, right on.
Exactly.
So listen, thank you so much for listening today to the Thank God for the Beatles podcast. This is Karen and my brother Jeff, and you can find this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Anchor, and other platforms. Also, we have a YouTube channel. In case you're interested, you can always... I've put up a picture of the boys from this session of the Sgt. Pepper sessions that you could check out as well. And we appreciate your time. Be well. Take care, and we'll see you for the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.